If your father came home from the Pacific and never spoke about a place called Kwajalein, there is a reason. It was not because what happened there was too terrible. It was because what happened there was too successful. And in the country that sent him, we tend to only remember the battles that broke our hearts. In the winter of 1943, an American admiral sat in a conference room at Pearl Harbor and told three of the finest military commanders in the United States that he was going to do something they all believed would kill thousands of Marines. Two of them called it reckless to his face. One of them refused to leave the room until he changed his mind. He did not change his mind. And 90 days later, on an atoll most Americans still cannot find on a map, 372 American soldiers and Marines died taking a target where the planners had expected to lose thousands. The admiral's name was Chester William Nimitz. Some of what he did in those 90 days would not be declassified until the 1970s. Some of it, the American public still does not fully know. This is that story. The room was on the second floor of the SignPack headquarters building at Pearl Harbor. December 14th, 1943, the blinds were drawn. 3 ceiling fans turned slowly overhead, moving warm Pacific air across a long table covered in charts. There was a pitcher of water, a pot of coffee that had gone cold, and 4 men, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, sat at the head of the table. 58 years old, silver hair cropped close, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of face that gives nothing away, not because it is hiding something, but because it has learned over 30 years in the United States Navy that a commander's face is a document his subordinates read to know how frightened they are allowed to be. To his right, Vice Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, 57, quiet, precise. The man Nimitz had trusted with Midway when nothing else was available. Across from Spruance, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, 58, amphibious warfare commander, a temper that everyone in the room knew about, including him. And beside Turner, Marine Major General Holland McTire Smith, 61 years old, nickname Howling Mad, not ironic. Nimitz had just laid out a plan, not a suggestion. A plan. He wanted to bypass WWII, he wanted to bypass Malolap. He wanted to take the entire Fifth Fleet, everything the United States had assembled in the Central Pacific, and drive it straight into Kwajalein Atoll, the administrative heart of the Japanese Marshall Islands, 400 miles behind the enemy's outer ring of airfields. He looked at Spruance. "Raymond," he said, "what do you think?" Spruance answered first. Too dangerous. Kelly Turner did not wait to be asked. Reckless. Outright reckless. Holland Smith agreed. Take the outer islands first. WWII, Malolap, build your air cover. Then move on Kwajalein. 3 men, 3 answers, all the same. Now here is the thing you need to understand about the man sitting at the head of that table. 3 weeks earlier, Chester Nimitz had stood on a strip of coral called Betio, 2 miles long, not even a quarter of a mile wide. The kind of place you could walk across in less time than it takes to boil an egg. The Marines had taken it on November 20th, 76 hours of fighting. When Nimitz landed there on November 25th, the island had not yet buried its dead. He walked the length of it anyway. Every coconut palm gone, every structure collapsed or burned. The sand itself churned black in places from the weight of the naval bombardment. And beneath all of it, the men. Back at Pearl Harbor, the letters were already piling up on his desk. Hundreds of them, from mothers and fathers in Ohio and Georgia and Pittsburgh and San Diego, every one of them saying in one form or another the same sentence: "You killed my son on Tarawa for nothing." Nimitz was going to read every single one of them. 3 weeks after standing in that smell, he was going to sit in this room, hear his 3 best commanders tell him no, and make a decision that only one man in the United States Navy had the authority to make. If this is the kind of story you want more of, if this is the kind of history you were raised on, hit the like button. It helps other Americans find it. 2 months after that conference, 36,000 artillery rounds would fall on a single island smaller than most commercial airports. A rear admiral would order a battleship so close to the enemy shore that his sailors could watch individual palm trees explode under 16-inch guns. And a 22-year-old Marine from Tacoma, Washington, with 4 words tattooed on his arm would prove that they were not just words. This is the story of what Chester Nimitz did in the 90 days between the horror of Tarawa and the miracle of Kwajalein. It is the story of a document that no civilian was ever supposed to read. It is the story of a piece of intelligence he could not share, not even with the men who were about to risk their lives on his orders. It is the story of a promise a man made quietly at his desk in the middle of a war to the people who had trusted him with their sons. Let us go back to Tarawa first, because November 20th, 1943, 0500 hours. The 2nd Marine Division was on the water, thousands of men in landing craft and amphibious tractors, closing on Betio Island in the darkness before dawn. The plan called for a 3-hour naval bombardment to soften the beach. Then the first wave would go in. The Higgins boats, flat-bottomed and shallow-drafted, would slide over the reef with 4 feet of water beneath them, hit the sand, drop their ramps, and the Marines would do what Marines had been doing since 1776. That was the plan. What the planners did not fully understand was that November 20th, 1943 was one of the 2 days each year when a neap tide holds the water down over Betio's reef. Instead of 4 feet, there were 3, maybe less in places. The Higgins boats scraped to a halt 800 yards from shore. Their engines howled against the coral. The ramps could not drop into water shallow enough for men to wade in. They dropped into open ocean under machine gun fire. The Marines went over the sides anyway, chest deep, then waist deep, then knee deep, 800 yards. The distance from home plate to the far end of most airport runways, under fire the entire way from Japanese defensive positions that the 3-hour bombardment had rattled but not destroyed, because the bombardment had used high explosive shells designed to detonate on the surface. The Japanese had spent 2 years building bunkers from reinforced concrete and coconut logs designed to absorb exactly that. 125 amphibious tractors, the tracked vehicles that could actually crawl across the reef, had been allocated for the assault. By nightfall on the first day, most of them were gone, burning on the beach, sunk in the lagoon, their crews dead or wounded inside. The Japanese commander on the island was Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, 49 years old, a veteran of the campaigns in China. Before the battle, he had told his men that 1 million Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years. He died on the first day. A shell fragment from a naval gun, ironically. The bombardment that had failed to destroy his bunkers had found him anyway, in the open, moving between positions. 76 hours later, the island was American. 1,009 Marines dead, 29 sailors, 2,101 wounded, on a piece of coral smaller than New York's Central Park, November 25th. 2 days after the fighting ended, Nimitz flew in. The airstrip on Betio had taken fire throughout the battle. Engineers were still patching craters. The plane landed anyway. Nimitz stepped down onto the coral and stood for a moment looking. Beside him was Major General Julian Cotton Smith, commander of the 2nd Marine Division, the man whose Marines had taken the island. Julian Smith was 58, gray, exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that goes past sleep. The 2 men began to walk the length of Betio. There were still bodies. The burial details had been working for 2 days without stopping. There were not enough of them. The island was only 2 miles long. There was nowhere to walk that was far from the work still to be done. Not a coconut palm still standing. Not a building above chest height. The wreckage of amphibious tractors, half sunk in the sand where they had died, coming ashore. Nimitz walked all of it. He did not write much about what he saw. Some men, when they see something they cannot explain, write pages. Nimitz was not that kind of man. He wrote a letter to his wife, Catherine, from Pearl Harbor after he got back. Catherine was 52 years old. She had been married to him since 1913. She had raised 4 children while he went to sea. She knew, better than almost anyone alive, how to read what he did and did not say. The letter is short. The relevant passage reads, and this is verbatim from the archives at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. Not a coconut tree of thousands was left whole. The stench was terrific from bodies yet unburied, even though our troops were working hard to bury the dead. That is what he told his wife. To the press, he said something else. He said the Marines had covered themselves with glory. He said their morale after the battle was very high. Both of those things were also true. But the letter to Catherine is what he actually saw. Back at Pearl Harbor, the mail was waiting. Nimitz's aide was Lieutenant Commander Arthur H. Lamar. Everyone called him Hal. Hal Lamar was in his mid-30s, and his job was to manage everything that came in and out of the Admiral's office. He was, in the strictest sense, Nimitz's gatekeeper. He decided what got through. He decided what could wait. And in late November of 1943, he tried to decide that the letters from the families of dead Marines could wait, or could be handled by staff, or could be answered with a form letter signed by an aide. Nimitz disagreed. He read them, everyone, hundreds of them arriving every day, from small towns and big cities, from mothers and fathers and wives and sisters and brothers. Some of them were long. Some of them were half a page torn from a school notebook. Some of them were typed. Most were handwritten. All of them said in one way or another the same thing. My son is dead, and it is your fault. Nimitz answered them by hand. No form letter, no template. He sat at his desk in the evenings after the day's business was done, and he wrote back. He told his wife in another letter that he was as distressed as could be. He used the word prayed. He said he prayed for the war to end, to stop the killing, to stop the maiming. He visited the naval hospitals. He walked the wards. He sat beside the beds of men who had lost arms, lost legs, lost eyes, lost pieces of themselves that a 19-year-old from Kansas had not known were possible to lose until that morning on the beach at Betio. He stood beside the bed of a young soldier who was dying and told him his country was proud of him. The young man died with a smile. Nimitz walked back out into the corridor. The next morning he came back to his desk and he began to make his decisions. Here is what no history book ever quite captures about what Chester Nimitz was carrying in those weeks. He knew Tarawa had to be taken. That was the strategic reality. To reach the Marshalls, you needed the Gilberts. To reach the Marianas, you needed the Marshalls. To bring the B-29 within range of Tokyo, you needed the Marianas. Every link in that chain was required. He was not going to lie to himself about that, and he was not going to lie to the families in his letters. But the way it had been done, the tide calculation that no one had caught, the bombardment that had not lasted long enough, the landing craft that could not cross the reef, the amphibious tractors that had been too few, all of that was fixable. That was going to be fixed. And every decision he made from that point forward, every choice about where to hit next and how to hit it was going to be shaped not by what he had read in an after-action report, but by what he had walked through with his own feet on that island. While all of this was happening at Pearl Harbor, something else was happening in Washington. The Marine cameramen who had gone in with the assault on Betio had come home with film. Their names were Staff Sergeant Norman T. Hatch and a team of about 15 combat photographers. Hatch was 22 years old. He had gone across Red Beach on the first day carrying a Bell and Howell camera and a .45 caliber pistol. The footage he brought back was in color, and it showed things American audiences had never seen. Dead Marines floating in the lagoon, face down on the sand. The film was edited by a team at Warner Brothers under the direction of Marine Captain Louis Hayward. Hayward was 34. Before the war, he had been a Hollywood actor, swashbucklers mostly. He had commanded the photographic unit at Tarawa personally, and he would receive the Bronze Star for it. The documentary was called With the Marines at Tarawa, and no one in the American film industry would touch it. The footage was too graphic. It violated every standing agreement about what the public was allowed to see. And the only person in the United States with the authority to override those agreements was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The film was brought to the White House. Roosevelt was 61 years old, exhausted by 4 years of running a global war from a wheelchair, and deeply uncertain about what to do. Show the American public what the Pacific War actually looked like, and you risked shattering the morale that was funding it, hide it, and you insulted the men who had died to bring the footage home. He asked to speak with someone he trusted who had actually been on Betio. The man he called was Robert Sherrod, 34 years old, a correspondent for Time and Life magazines. Sherrod had gone in with the Marines. He had seen it firsthand. And when Roosevelt asked him whether the film should be released, Sherrod said something that has been recorded in his own writings after the war. He said, "I tell the president the truth. Our soldiers on the front want people back home to know that they don't knock the hell out of them every day of every battle. They want people to understand that war is a horrible, nasty business." Roosevelt released the film uncensored. It went into more than 16,000 theaters in March of 1944. It won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Short Subject. War bond sales soared. Marine Corps recruiting dropped 35% in the same period. Both of those things were true. Both of them were consequences of one decision by one president to trust the American public with what their sons had actually died doing. But while Roosevelt was making his decision in Washington, Nimitz was making a different one at Pearl Harbor, and his decision would not be released to the public. His decision would not win an Academy Award. His decision would sit in a locked filing cabinet in the Pacific Fleet Planning section, and it would be read by exactly the men who needed to read it, and no one else. He had asked his planning officer, Captain James Steele, to compile a document. Captain James Steele was not a famous man. He is not famous now. If you look him up in the standard histories of the Pacific War, you will find his name in a footnote, if at all. But in the first week of December 1943, he was sitting at a desk in the planning section at Pearl Harbor with a stack of after-action reports, a fresh pad of paper, and an order from Chester Nimitz. The order was simple. Write down everything that went wrong at Tarawa. Every mistake, every misjudgment, every piece of equipment that failed, every assumption that turned out to be false, every man who died because of something we did or did not do. Write it all down, and do not stop at 10, do not stop at 50, do not stop until you have run out of things to say. Steele did not stop until he had 100. He called the document exactly what it was: 100 mistakes made on Tarawa. It was not a book. It was not a public report. It was not a memoir. It was a workshop manual. It was the kind of document that engineers write when they are tearing an engine apart to find out why it seized. And every line in it was paid for by a man who had gone into the surf at Betio and not come out. The tide calculation written down, the naval bombardment timeline written down, the failure of high explosive shells against reinforced concrete written down, the shortage of amphibious tractors written down, seaward landing approach that had put Marines directly into the strongest Japanese defensive arc written down. While Steele was working, another document was being written at sea. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the same man who would sit across from Nimitz on December 14th and call the Kwajalein plan reckless, was on his flagship on the voyage back, writing his own after-action report. Turner's version had a title even a bureaucrat could love: Recommendations for Changes and Improvements in Tactics, Techniques, Existing Instructions, and Material. He filed it on November 30th, 1943. 5 days after Nimitz walked Betio, Turner and Steele did not compare notes. They did not need to. They had both seen the same thing, and they had both come home determined that it would not happen again. While all of this was being written down at Pearl Harbor, no civilian in America knew any of it. The film was still being edited in Washington. The public conversation about Tarawa was about whether it had been worth it. The military conversation, the one Nimitz was actually running, was about how to make sure the next one was not. None of it would be released to the press. Ever. Now, at exactly the same time, 400 miles west of Tarawa, in the Marshall Islands, a Japanese admiral was making a decision of his own. His name was Rear Admiral Masashi Kobayashi. He was the commander of Japanese forces in the Marshalls. He had a career built the way careers are built in an imperial navy that does not tolerate mistakes. Naval Academy at Etojima, steady rise, trusted by his superiors, given a command that mattered. Kobayashi had a problem. He had roughly 28,000 men to defend the entire Marshall chain. He had airfields, he had garrisons, he had coastal guns. But he did not have enough of any of it to fortify every atoll to the level that Betio had been fortified. He had to choose. So he did what any competent officer in his position would do. He looked at the American pattern. The Americans had taken Tarawa. Before that, they had taken the Solomons. Before that, they had come ashore at Guadalcanal. Everywhere they had gone, they had worked from the outside in. Cautious, methodical, establishing air bases before they moved forward, reducing risk step by step by step. Kobayashi looked at that pattern and he made his decision. He moved the bulk of his best troops and his heaviest fortifications to the outer atolls, to Wache, to Malolap, to Mili, to Jalui. These were the islands closest to Pearl Harbor. These were the islands the Americans, based on everything they had done in the previous 18 months, would obviously hit first. He left Kwajalein in the center of the chain, more lightly defended, roughly 8,000 men at the atoll. And of those 8,000, only about half were actual combat troops. The rest were Korean laborers who had been brought to the islands by force and who had no particular interest in dying for the Japanese emperor. The Kwajalein garrison commander was Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama, and he was defending an atoll that his superiors had implicitly decided was a secondary line of resistance. Kobayashi was reading the Americans the way any good officer reads an enemy. He was reading them correctly. He was reading a pattern that was about to change, because in a room at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's photo reconnaissance analysts were laying out fresh imagery of the Marshalls on a long table, high altitude passes, low altitude passes, every atoll photographed and rephotographed through late November and early December. And what the analysts were seeing was exactly what Kobayashi had built. Wache, fortified. Malolap, fortified. Mili, fortified. Jaluit, fortified. Kwajalein, lighter, not undefended, not easy, but lighter. Nimitz's senior planner, Rear Admiral Forrest Percival Sherman, 47 years old, looked at the photographs and gave his assessment in one word: feasible, not safe, not certain, not without risk. Feasible, his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Charles Horatio McMorris, 53, agreed. Now here is what history books did not print for another 30 years. What Chester Nimitz knew that morning at Pearl Harbor. What he could not tell his three commanders, what he carried alone from that conference room all the way to his grave in San Bruno, California in 1966. He knew because he was reading the mail of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Since the spring of 1942, a team of American cryptographers under a Navy commander named Joseph Rochefort had been breaking the main operational code of the Imperial Japanese Navy. That code was called JN-25. Its breaking had made possible the American victory at Midway in June of 1942. It had made possible the interception and killing of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto over Bougainville in April of 1943. By the end of 1943, the Americans were reading Japanese naval communications on a scale that the Japanese, throughout the war, never fully grasped. The intelligence had a code name: Ultra. Ultra was the most closely held secret of the Second World War. Its existence would not be publicly acknowledged for another 30 years. And Nimitz was one of a very small number of American commanders who was allowed to see it in its raw form. What Ultra was telling him in late 1943 was that Kobayashi had done exactly what the photographs suggested. He had committed his best troops to the outer islands. He was waiting for an American attack that was going to come from the direction any sensible enemy would attack from. Nimitz had a decision to make. If he acted on that intelligence, if he changed his plan and went straight for Kwajalein, he could not share the raw source of his certainty with his commanders. He could show them conclusions. He could not show them the intercepts. Because if the source ever leaked, if the Japanese ever figured out how completely their code had been broken, they would change it. Every American life saved by Ultra from that point forward, in every battle to come, would be lost. So Nimitz made a private calculation. He would present the change as his own judgment. He would let his commanders think he was making a leap based on the aerial photographs and his own instinct. He would take the blame for it if it failed. He would carry it alone. That was the calculation he made in the second week of December 1943. The meeting was scheduled for the 14th. The morning of December 14th was warm. Pearl Harbor in December is warm. The men came into the conference room in tropical uniform. Nimitz was already there. He had been in the room for some time before anyone else arrived. That was his habit. When you called a meeting, you did not walk into a room where other men were waiting for you. You were already there when they walked in. Sherman and McMorris were on his side of the table. They already knew what was coming. They had helped shape it. Their job now was to say nothing. Spruance came in and sat down, a man who walked 10 miles every morning before his staff arrived at the office and was at his desk before any of them. Turner sat across from Spruance. Holland Smith took the seat beside Turner, 61 and looking every day of it. Nimitz laid it out. The photographs, the analysis, the concept, bypass Wacha, bypass Malolap, take the 5th Fleet Tire assembled amphibious force and drive straight into Kwajalein. He did not raise his voice. He did not sell it. He laid it out the way an engineer describes a bridge. This is what we would do. This is how it would work. This is why we believe it is possible. Then he did something that was, in its own quiet way, revealing. He went around the room. He asked each man individually what he thought. Not as a group, not by show of hands, one by one. He wanted to hear every objection, every concern, every reason it might fail. He wanted to hear it out loud from each of them before he made his decision. Raymond, he said, what do you think? Spruance answered first. He laid out the strategic danger. Kwajalein sat deep inside Japanese-controlled waters. Enemy airfields on Wachi and Malolap and Mili would surround them on every side. Supply lines would be exposed. If the landing stalled, if the Japanese reinforced from the outer islands faster than expected, there was no fallback position. It was too dangerous. Turner went next. He did not wait to be prompted. Reckless, outright reckless. The plan violated the proper military sequence. You took the outer islands first. You built your air bases. You reduced the risk. That was how you fought this kind of war. Turner had commanded the amphibious force at Tarawa. He had watched what happened when the plan did not account for every variable. He was not going to sign off on a plan that started with a leap of 400 miles into the strongest concentration of enemy airfields in the Central Pacific. Holland Smith agreed. Take Wacha first. Take Malolap. Then move on Kwajalein when you had land-based air support. 3 men, 3 answers, all the same. The room was quiet. Nimitz had heard exactly what he expected to hear. Nothing his 3 commanders had said was new to him. He had been running these objections against the intelligence for 2 weeks. He had been running them against the photographs. He had been running them against Ultra. He had been running them when the office was empty at night, against the letters still arriving from the families of the men who had died in the surf at Betio. He looked around the table and then he said it. Quietly, well, gentlemen, our next target will be Kwajalein. Most of the men in the room gathered their papers and left. Sherman and McMorris, Holland Smith. The staff officers, the room emptied. Spruance and Turner stayed. Whatever decorum had governed the formal meeting was over now. The 2 admirals pressed their case directly, face to face. They used the same words Turner had used at the table. Dangerous, reckless. Nimitz was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who ended arguments with rank. In 30 years of the Navy, the people who had worked closest to him had almost uniformly described him the same way. Calm, approachable, genuinely open to being wrong. He let Spruance finish. He let Turner finish. Then he said it. If you don't want to do it, well, I'll find someone who will. Spruance and Turner walked out of the room. The decision had been made. What no one in that room could know, what only Nimitz could know, was that Kobayashi in the Marshals had done exactly what Spruance and Turner had just predicted Nimitz would do. He had read the American pattern. He had moved his best troops to watch in Maloelap. He was ready for an attack that was not coming. Nimitz had crossed a gap between the evidence he could show and the certainty he actually had. He had crossed it alone, and he was going to carry that gap alone for the rest of the war and past the end of it until Ultra was declassified in the 1970s, and historians finally understood what he had actually been sitting on that morning in December. Between the 14th of December 1943 and the 31st of January 1944, the United States Navy did something that had never been done in the history of amphibious warfare. It took every mistake on Steele's list and it fixed it. There were 5 specific changes, every one of them written in blood at Tarawa, every one of them written now in ink at Pearl Harbor. The first was the naval bombardment. Betio, the ships had fired for 3 hours. Against Kwajalein, the ships would fire for 3 days, and they would not use high explosive shells designed to burst on contact. They would use armor-piercing rounds, rounds designed to punch through reinforced concrete before they detonated inside the bunker that was supposed to protect the man behind it. The second was the approach. At Betio, the landing had come from the ocean side, the obvious side, the side the Japanese had spent 2 years fortifying. Against Kwajalein, every major landing would come from the lagoon side, where the coral was thinner, where the water was deeper closer to shore, where the Japanese had not believed American amphibious vehicles could reach. The third was the preliminary seizure of small islands before the Marines went ashore at WWII and Namur in the north, and before the Army's 7th Infantry Division went ashore at Kwajalein Island in the south. American forces would land the day before on the small islets around the atoll, tiny pieces of coral, some of them barely wide enough for a man to stand on, but wide enough for artillery. By the night before the main assault, Army howitzers would have their guns registered on Kwajalein Island. Marine artillery on captured islets in the north would have WWII and Namur zeroed in. When the main landing came, every major target would be hit from land and sea simultaneously. The fourth was the underwater demolition teams. After Tarawa, Kelly Turner had ordered the formation of 9 of them. These were the men who swam in ahead of the landing craft. They mapped the reef, they marked the channels, they destroyed obstacles. They made sure the men coming in behind them would not learn about a problem by dying in it. They were the forerunners of what the Navy would later call the SEAL teams. The fifth was the landing craft. The amphibious tractors, the LVTs, had been reinforced, better armored, better armed. There were more of them, enough to carry the first waves across the reef, regardless of what the tide was doing on any given morning. 5 changes. None of them clever, all of them obvious, all of them paid for by the men in the surf at Betio. But there was one more change that no document on Steele's list could describe, because it was not a piece of equipment. It was a man. His name was Rear Admiral Richard Lansing Connelly, 51 years old, commander of the Northern Attack Force. He was not a famous admiral. He was not the kind of officer whose name ended up in newspaper headlines. He had an engineer's mind in an admiral's uniform, and he had a belief, simple and almost blunt, that he had been working toward for most of his career. You cannot destroy a fortified position by firing shells at it from a comfortable distance. A shell fired from 2 miles away arrives at an angle. It hits the roof of the bunker or the side or the ground in front of it. Some percentage of the time, it does real damage. The rest of the time, it does nothing the defenders cannot walk away from. A shell fired from close range arrives nearly flat. It hits the face of the bunker directly. It has enough velocity to drive through the wall, not just rattle it. If you want to destroy a hardened position, really destroy it, not just inconvenience it, you have to get close. This is what Connelly believed. On the afternoon of February 1st, 1944, he was going to prove it. At 12 minutes past noon, Connelly sent a signal to the battleship USS Maryland. It has been preserved in the operational records of the Northern Attack Force. It reads in plain unmilitary English that stood out in a Navy that ran on precise technical language: move in really close. Not advance to coordinates, not reduce range to optimum firing distance. Close. The Maryland moved. Her 16-inch guns pulled to within 1,500 yards of the Japanese shore, a little under a mile, well inside the range of Japanese coastal defense guns, well inside the range of Japanese anti-aircraft artillery repurposed for shore defense. The Japanese gunners could see the ship. The ship's crew could see the shore. They could watch through their gun sights as individual coconut palms disintegrated under 16-inch shells fired at nearly point-blank range. The bunkers that had survived 2 days of conventional naval bombardment began to come apart. The Japanese soldiers who had been sheltering inside them were no longer being rattled by near misses. They were being hit. From that afternoon forward, Richard Lansing Connelly had a nickname that would follow him for the rest of the war and the rest of his life: Close in Connelly. He had put his own ships in danger to save his Marines. That is not a complicated calculation in the abstract. Every commander understands the trade-off in principle. What takes something more than understanding is the willingness to actually do it. To order your own ships into the range of enemy guns because you believe the men on the beach are worth more than the risk to your hull. Connelly believed it. He proved it. The rubber boats went into the water before dawn. January 31st, 1944. 0400 hours. The Marshall Islands. Somewhere in the dark, on the southern edge of Kwajalein Atoll, soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division were sliding over the sides of their transports and paddling toward 4 small islets that most Americans could not have found on a map. The largest of them not much bigger than a city block. The Japanese on those islets were not combat troops. They were communications men, aviation ground crew, support personnel who had never expected to fight a ground battle. By nightfall, all 4 islands were American. And by midnight, on the island called Carlson, the men of the 145th Field Artillery Battalion were setting up their howitzers by flashlight, laying registration on targets across the water they had not yet seen but had studied on maps for weeks. Kwajalein Island, 3 miles across the lagoon. Now within range, 45 miles to the north, on smaller islets around Roy and Namur, Marines from the 25th Regiment were doing the same thing. 5 more small islands, 5 more artillery platforms. The twin Japanese airfields on Roy and Namur were now zeroed in from land. At his headquarters in the Marshalls, Rear Admiral Masashi Kobayashi was reading his own reports. And the picture they painted was not the one he had built for. The Americans had bypassed Wochi, they had bypassed Maloa-Lap, they had bypassed Mili, they had bypassed Jaluit, the best troops he had, the heaviest fortifications he had spent months building, the airfields he had counted on to break any attack against the outer ring. All of it was behind the American fleet now, useless, sitting on islands the Americans were not going to attack. They had gone straight for the center. Kobayashi had done everything a professional officer is supposed to do. He had read the enemy's pattern. He had made a defensible strategic choice. He had committed his resources where the evidence said they were most needed. And he had been played, not by a lucky guess, not by an American commander gambling on instinct. He had been played by a piece of intelligence he did not know existed, from a broken code he did not know had been broken, sent to a man at Pearl Harbor who was not allowed to tell his own subordinates where the certainty came from. There is no dishonor in what Kobayashi did. He fought the war with the information he had. The problem was that a 58-year-old admiral in Hawaii had more information than he did. Kobayashi would survive the war. He would be relieved of his command not long after the Marshalls fell. He would return to Japan, live quietly in the years after the surrender, and die in Tokyo in the 1970s, Benable Conceived, having never learned, so far as any historian has been able to confirm, what had actually been read in his mail. Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama, commanding the Kwajalein garrison itself, had roughly 8,000 men. Half of them were Korean laborers. The other half were combat troops, but their fortifications had been built to face the seaward approaches, not the lagoon. The bombardment began on the morning of February 1st. 3 days had already gone into softening the atoll. Now the full weight of the Fifth Fleet came down at once. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, the Army howitzers on Carlson, the Marine artillery on the captured islets in the north, carrier aircraft from Task Force 58. On Kwajalein Island in the south, 7,000 naval rounds fell on the Japanese garrison in a single day. The artillery on Carlson added 29,000 more, 36,000 shells, on an island 2.5 miles long and less than half a mile wide. At the northern end of the atoll, on Roy, Connelly's ships were doing what Connelly had promised they would do. The USS Maryland was 1,500 yards off the beach. The 14-inch and 16-inch guns of the supporting battleships were firing at bunkers the crews could see with the naked eye, and the bunkers were coming apart. The Marines of the 23rd Regiment went ashore at 11:45 in the morning. They came in from the lagoon side in the reinforced LVTs. The first wave crossed the reef, then the second, then the third. The defenders who came out of the shattered concrete were not the men who had gone in. 3 days of bombardment, 3 days of Connelly's ships firing at point-blank range had done something the planners had not quite dared to count on. It had broken them. The Japanese soldiers who emerged from the smoke were still armed. Some of them still fought. But they came out dazed, disoriented, blinking into the light like men who had been buried alive for a week. The Marines moved across the airfield. At 6 o'clock that evening, 7 hours after the first wave hit the beach, the 23rd Marines declared Royce secure. 3,500 Japanese defenders, one island, 7 hours. At Tarawa, Betio had taken 76. But the story of February 1st on Roy is not just about what the bombardment did. It is about one man who was not supposed to be there at all. Private First Class Richard Betty Anderson, born June 26, 1921, Tacoma, Washington. He grew up in Agnew, a small community on the Olympic Peninsula, the kind of place where the nearest city was an hour away. He graduated from Sequim High School on July 6, 1942, 7 months after Pearl Harbor. He walked into a recruiting office in Oakland, California, and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. He was 21 years old. He joined Company East, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines, 4th Marine Division. On his arm, he had a tattoo with 4 words: death before dishonor. He shipped out for the Central Pacific in January of 1944. On the morning of February 1st, Richard Anderson was a mortar man. His job was in the rear with his weapon, with his crew, providing indirect fire for the rifle companies moving ahead of him. For reasons that no one who was there was ever able to fully explain, Anderson was not with his mortar crew that afternoon. He was at the front, moving across the airfield on Roy with the rifle companies, carrying a box of grenades. The airfield had been cratered by 3 days of naval gunfire. Some of the craters were deep enough that a man could drop into one and disappear from sight. They offered cover. In the middle of the afternoon, Anderson spotted one of those craters ahead of him. He dropped into it. 3 other Marines were already inside. And then, in a fraction of a second, the kind of second that no citation ever fully explains, a grenade landed at the bottom of the crater. 4 men. No time to pick it up and throw it clear. No time to climb out. No time for anything except one decision. Richard Anderson threw himself on it. He took the full force of the explosion. The 3 men in the crater with him walked off the island alive. Anderson was pulled out of the crater and carried back to the beach. He was evacuated to the USS Callaway, a transport ship anchored in the lagoon. He died on board that day, February 1st, 1944. He was 22 years old. He was buried at sea with full military honors somewhere in the waters off Roy. 6 months and 16 days later, on August 17th, 1944, a ceremony was held at Pier 91 at the Naval Station in Seattle. His mother, Mrs. Oscar Anderson, stood at the front. She accepted the Medal of Honor on behalf of her son. The citation, and this is verbatim from the official record, read as follows: "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Private First Class Anderson fearlessly chose to sacrifice himself and save his companions by hurling his body upon the grenade and taking the full impact of the explosion. He gallantly gave his life for his country." His mother held the medal. The following July, a destroyer was launched at the Todd Pacific shipyards in Seattle. On July 7th, 1945, a year and 5 months after her son died, Mrs. Oscar Anderson was back at that waterfront, this time to christen the ship that would carry his name, USS Richard B. Anderson, hull number DD-786. She would serve for 30 years. Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War. 3 decades of the United States Navy carrying the name of a 22-year-old mortarman from Agnew, Washington, into waters her son never got to see. Richard Anderson did not know Chester Nimitz. He did not know that 2 months earlier, an admiral in Hawaii had sat in a conference room and overruled 3 of the finest commanders in America because he was not going to waste a single life he could save. He did not know Richard Connelly. He did not know about the battleships that had moved to 1,500 yards so that the bunkers on his airfield would be broken before he set foot on it. He did not know any of it. He was a kid from a small town on the Olympic Peninsula who was in the wrong place at the right moment. Here is what connects them. Nimitz read those letters because he could not look away from what his decisions cost other people. Connelly moved his ships closer because he could not accept a version of success that wasted lives he could have saved. Anderson threw himself on that grenade because he could not let 3 men die if there was anything left in him to stop it. 3 different men, 3 different ranks, 3 different versions of the same refusal to let the people beside them pay a price they could absorb instead. None of them knew the others. All of them were there on February 1st, 1944. The battle for Kwajalein Island itself, the main Japanese base in the south, was harder than Roy. The 7th Infantry Division fought for 4 days, building by building, bunker by bunker. The Japanese garrison did not surrender. They fought until they were dead. Kwajalein Island was declared secure on February 4th. When the final accounting was done across the entire atoll, Roy and Namur in the north, Kwajalein Island in the south, the dozens of smaller islets taken in between, the numbers looked like this: Japanese dead, more than 8,000, more than 8,000 Japanese captured, a few hundred, most of them Korean laborers who had never wanted to be there in the first place. Americans killed, 372 men, across an operation involving tens of thousands of assault troops and hundreds of warships. On a target defended by 8,000, now hold those numbers next to Tarawa, Betio, 2 miles long, less than half a mile wide, 4,500 Japanese defenders. Americans killed more than 1,000. Kwajalein Atoll, 8,000 defenders, more than twice the size. Americans killed 372, less than a third. The military planners had estimated, based on everything they knew, that Kwajalein would take longer and cost more than Tarawa. They were wrong in the best possible way. Nimitz had expected the operation to run until mid-February. Roy and Namur fell on February 2nd. Kwajalein Island fell on February 4th. He was weeks ahead of schedule. On February 5th, he flew in. He had done this before. Landed on a newly taken island before the engineers had finished clearing it. He walked the ground. In the days that followed, as prisoner interrogations came back, a picture emerged of what was waiting at Eniwetok, the next major atoll in the chain, 400 miles to the northwest. The Japanese garrison there was smaller than expected. The fortifications were less developed. The window to hit them before they could be reinforced was open now. Nimitz did not call another meeting. He did not ask his commanders to form a committee. he called Spruance, the same man who had told him 2 months earlier that going straight to Kwajalein was dangerous and reckless. He told Spruance to take Inuit immediately with the reserves that had not been used at Kwajalein. The operation that had been scheduled for May would happen in February instead. 3 months ahead of schedule. Spruance said yes. He did not argue. He did not say, "You were right and I was wrong." He did not have to. He just executed the order. Inuit fell by February 23rd, 1944. The Central Pacific timetable had just been accelerated by roughly 60 days, which meant the Marianas would fall sooner, which meant Saipan and Tinian and Guam would fall sooner, which meant that from an airfield on Tinian, a B-29 named Enola Gay would eventually take off on a mission that shortened a war and ended an empire. Every link in that chain traces back to a room at Pearl Harbor on December 14th, 1943, and a man who said no to his 3 best commanders. Staff Sergeant Norman Hatch, the 22-year-old Marine cameraman who had gone across Red Beach at Tarawa with a Bell and Howell camera and a .45 caliber pistol, lived a long life. He came home. He went into the film business. He worked in documentaries for decades. He kept talking about what he had seen in interviews and speeches and living rooms for the rest of his life. He died in 2017. He was 96 years old. He was one of the last men alive who had walked those beaches with a camera in his hand. In interviews near the end of his life, Hatch would talk about Tarawa. He would talk about the men who died in the surf. He would talk about the ones who never came home. He said more than once that the country never quite understood what it had asked of that generation, not because the country was ungrateful, because the men themselves did not tell. The men of Kwajalein were even quieter than the men of Tarawa because they came home. There is a difference between a man who does not want to talk about what he saw and a man who does not think what he saw was worth talking about. Kwajalein produced a lot of the second kind. They had gone in expecting to die. Most of them had come out alive. They went home. Most of them had come out alive. They raised families. They mowed lawns. They coached Little League. They did not think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as lucky. And most of the country agreed with them because the country never learned what the alternative had almost been. After the war, there was an argument. Holland Smith wrote a book in 1948 called Coral and Brass. In it, he said that Tarawa had not been worth it, that the losses had been unnecessary, that the whole Gilbert's campaign had been a mistake. He was writing as a man who had walked those beaches, as a man who had commanded some of those Marines, as a man entitled to his opinion. Nimitz did not agree. His answer, given after the war, was short. The capture of Tarawa knocked down the front door to the Japanese defenses in the Central Pacific. Both men were telling the truth as they saw it. Both men had been there. Both men had walked the sand at Betio when it was still fresh. And neither of them ever fully resolved the question underneath what they were arguing about. Was it worth it? That question does not have a clean answer. It never did. Not in 1943. Not in 1948. Not now. 1,009 Marines died at Tarawa. 372 American soldiers and Marines died at Kwajalein. If Kwajalein had been fought like Tarawa, without the 100 mistakes corrected, without the 3-day bombardment, without the lagoon-side landing, without Connelly's ships at 1,500 yards, without Ultra, without every lesson bought at Betio, the number at Kwajalein would have been much higher. It might have been higher than Tarawa itself. The men who died at Betio did not die for nothing. They died for the men at Kwajalein. That is not a comfort. It is not supposed to be. It is a fact. And Chester Nimitz carried that fact with him in the quiet way he carried most things from November of 1943 until he died at his quarters on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay on the evening of February 20th, 1966. He was 80 years old. He was buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. The men buried beside him were not politicians. They were not statesmen. They were the officers he had served with and trusted. Raymond Spruance, who had told him the Kwajalein plan was too dangerous and then executed it. Richmond Kelly Turner, who had called it reckless and then made it work. Charles Lockwood, who had run the submarines that starved an empire. They had arranged it while they were still alive, to be together in the ground the way they had been together in the war. There was no ceremony. There was no arrangement made for cameras. Just the men who had done the work buried together the way they had always preferred to operate, out of the spotlight, getting on with it. There is something worth saying before we close this story about what Chester Nimitz actually believed. He believed that the highest job of a commander is not to win battles. It is to bring men home. He believed that a decision made from a safe office in Washington is not the same as a decision made by a man who has walked the sand where the bodies were. He believed that the country he served owed a debt to the boys it sent into that sand, and that the way you paid that debt was by never wasting one of them if you could help it. That is not a fashionable way to think about war anymore. In some rooms, it is not even a permitted way to think about it, but it is what the men of Kwajalein came home to. It is what Nimitz went to his grave believing. And it is one of the reasons that a generation of Americans, most of them now gone, taught their sons and their grandsons to stand up when the flag went by. If your father served in the Pacific, if your uncle came home from those islands and never told you what he saw, if there is a name in your family from that generation, from a small town on the Olympic Peninsula, or a farm in Georgia, or a neighborhood in Pittsburgh, whose story never made it into the history books, leave the name in the comments below. The branch, the theater. Whatever you know, whatever you were told at a dinner table long ago by a man who did not usually tell, because the men of Kwajalein did not get the headlines. The battle was won too cleanly, won too well. History is drawn to the places where the price was highest, where the photographs were most devastating, where the casualty lists ran longest. Kwajalein was not that kind of battle. Kwajalein is the battle that history forgot because it went right. But the men who did not come home from it were not an abstraction. They were somebody's son, somebody's husband, somebody's father. They were boys who had grown up in the years between the wars during the Depression, in a country that was still figuring out what it was and what it owed the world. They answered a question that none of them had wanted to be asked, and on an atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that most Americans still cannot place on a map, they did what was asked of them. Chester Nimitz remembered them. He read every letter. He answered every one. And when the war was over and the ceremonies were done and the photographs had been taken on the deck of the Missouri, he went back to his desk and he wrote his final report on the Pacific War, and he named the men whose decisions had been correct, and he did not name himself. That was the way he worked. That was the way he preferred it. The least we can do all these years later is notice.